When I look at my life, I see it in two parts. My life before I found God, and my life after I found God. The God Experience Part 1. Before I found God. Chapter 1. Beginnings. It all began when Forrest met Dolores. Forrest Van Zandt Smith II, the youngest of three children, was born November 9, 1922 in Haverhill, Massachusetts. His parents, both of English descent, were Forrest Van Zandt Smith Sr. and Blanche Robbins. His father was a prominent figure in Haverhill, even becoming mayor of the city in the late 1920s. They were a wealthy family until they lost most of their money during the stock market crash of 1929. And although it changed their lives in a material sense, it didn't change them in a deeply profound way, because what the Smith family did not lose on that Black Sunday was their love for each other. Growing up, young Forrest, my father, developed a love for music and aviation. Practicing along with 78 RPM records, he acquired enough musical ability to participate in jam sessions with fellow musicians. This love of playing and music was something that he would enjoy throughout his lifetime. It was around the same time that he became an avid modeler. With a keen eye and a steady hand, he produced a rather impressive collection of model airplanes. This is perhaps what inspired him to take to the skies and begin flying lessons. In 1940, he graduated high school and enlisted in the military with hopes of becoming a naval aviator. He completed his flight training in July of 1943 and went on to become a Navy fighter pilot based in the Pacific Theater of Combat. Asterisk newspaper article. Lieutenant Forrest Van Zandt Smith, Jr., age 22, son of former Mayor and Mrs. Forrest Van Zandt Smith, 13 Fernwood Ave, Bradford, has been awarded a Navy Air Medal and given a citation for meritorious achievement in the Battle of the Marianas, last June 19. Lieutenant Smith is now recovering at the Chelsea Naval Hospital from a fractured skull and other injuries received in an automobile accident in this city a few weeks ago while home on leave. This citation, presented to him at the hospital, credited him with aiding in the destruction of a Jap dive bomber, which had closed in on a naval task force. Lieutenant Smith was a pilot on a carrier-based fighter plane, and previous to the destruction of the dive bomber had destroyed a Japanese reconnaissance plane. He materially contributed to the complete failure of the enemy attack, according to the citation, and his skill and courage were at all times in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service. When the war was over, in which he served admirably, Forrest married his high school sweetheart, Shirley Tate. She gave birth to a son, Forrest Van Zandt Smith III, on February 9, 1946. It was only a few months later that tragedy struck, when the car he was driving, with his wife and child inside, got into a terrible accident. Fortunately, the baby was unharmed. Forrest sustained severe injuries that took him many months to recover from. His young wife, however, was killed. This tragic event caused him a great deal of physical and emotional pain. The accident was something he was always reluctant to talk about for the rest of his life, and for a very good reason. Picking up the pieces of his now broken life, he left his young son in the care of his deceased wife's parents and went back into aviation. After serving his country once again in the Korean War, he began to work as a commercial pilot. This consisted of shuttling small groups, mostly business people, over short distances in small aircraft. It was while performing this job that tragedy struck Forrest once again. While attempting to land his plane during intense fog on what he thought was a runway, Forrest landed smack dab into the icy cold waters of Boston Harbor. He and another passenger managed to exit the damaged aircraft that sank in a matter of seconds. Unfortunately, the other passengers had no time or were simply too incapacitated to escape and perished. Forrest now found himself in cold water with poor visibility and with a person who could not swim. His passenger told him, "Let me go and save yourself," but Forrest would have none of that. His response was, "Either we get through this together or we die together." It wasn't until the fog cleared when a woman who was outside hanging laundry noticed the two men in the water. She called her husband, who quickly grabbed his rowboat and rescued the two men from drowning. It would take quite some time for Forrest to get over this event, but he would one day take to the skies again and resume his passion for flying. This time it would be purely for recreation. With the past behind him, Forrest now looked to settle down and begin life anew. After working briefly as a car salesman, he began a job as a patent maker for a shoe company. It was also around this time that he met the woman who would become his second wife and my mother. Dolores Ann Carifio was born to Italian immigrants Giorgio Carifio and Filomena Uzzi in Haverhill, Massachusetts on April 5, 1930. Giorgio owned and operated a local roadhouse and worked as a part-time prize fighter. Filomena was a full-time mother and homemaker. Dolores was the youngest in a family of 7 boys and 2 girls. Times were hard for many families during the Great Depression, but like the Smith family, what the Carifios lacked in treasure, they made up for with love and family unity. She graduated high school in June of 1948 and immediately went to work for a local electric company. But her true ambition, like many of her generation, was to become a wife, mother, and homemaker. She met my father at an officers' party in 1959, but nothing became of it because at that time she had another man in her life. When her relationship with this man failed to blossom into marriage, she once again met my father, and this time the two went on a date. After a 1-year courtship, Forrest and Dolores were married in October of 1962. After living in a small apartment, they purchased a modest 2-bedroom ranch in a small town just north of the Massachusetts border. This is where they would start their family. On April 5, 1964, Dolores gave birth to a healthy 7-pound baby girl they named Leslie Robin Smith. Almost 15 months to the day later, the couple had their second child, a son. I, Perry Cloudman Smith, named after Forrest's best friend in the Navy, was born on June 30th, 1965. Chapter 2. It's a Boy. My earliest memory was also a milestone in the life of any young child, waking up with a dry diaper. I remember feeling so very proud. It was not long after this that my mother enrolled me at a local preschool. It was during my time at preschool that I became aware of the fact that I was a very shy and timid individual socially. In class, I was content to be quiet, observe, listen, and take directions. Memories from this period in my life are few, except for one very significant event that took place at this school. My first moral decision. The entire kindergarten class had drawn pictures, and the teacher had hung them all on the wall to display them. We had not put our names on the drawings, so when it came time to take them down and bring them home, the teacher had to ask each student which picture belonged to them. Now, as she's moving down the line, I see this cool drawing that I wanted, but the problem was, it wasn't the picture that I had drawn. As my mind was reeling with decision, the teacher finally gets down to me and asks, "Perry, which one of these drawings is yours?" To be honest, I don't recall which picture I chose, but what made this event so memorable was that it was my first real choice between right and wrong. The occasion still resonates within me some 45 years later. Do you recall your first moral decision? I began my elementary school tenure in the fall of 1971. First grade was held in an old church just about a stone's throw away from our house. Grades 2 through 5 were taught at a larger school, which just happens to be the oldest standing co-ed school in the nation, which was still only a short distance from home. My sister and I would often walk or ride our bikes there. Times were good, and I was steadily growing. At school, I was average academically, but I was making new friends and learning basic social behavior. But it was in the first grade where I made a most monumental discovery: girls. This one girl in particular had blonde hair, blue eyes, and was very pretty. I was aggressive in my pursuit of her, even going so far as trying to call her on the telephone. My determination was very surprising, considering that only a few short years later, I would become a tongue-tied, blubbering mess around the opposite sex. Around the age of 6 or 7, I began attending Sunday school to prepare for First Communion, which I did. The only memory I have from that experience was drawing pictures. Growing up, religion had little, if any, impact on my life and our household. My mother would call herself a Catholic, and my father called himself a Protestant, but you would never know it. They were simply titles. Neither of them attended church regularly or practiced any kind of religious ceremony or ritual other than Christmas and Easter. Even during holiday celebrations, there were never any overt spiritual messages. But my parents were good, kind, caring, and loving people who were completely devoted to my sister and I, and that was all that really mattered. My image of God at that time basically came from Hollywood movies and Old Testament biblical stories. Films and tales about the Great Flood, the Ten Commandments, the parting of the Red Sea, people turning into salt and burning bushes, were all that I knew about religion. God, in my mind, was an old Caucasian male with a long white beard and long flowing white robe. He would sit on a golden throne with a lightning bolt in one hand and a book of law in the other. God was basically good, but you wouldn't want to get him angry, or else he would be in big trouble. God was someone to be feared rather than someone to be embraced. He was a wise man with a bad temper. Asterisk. In the first edition of this book, I went out of my way not to assign gender to God, mainly because it does not apply. God transcends gender in the same way peace, love, wisdom, and unity do. Over the centuries, God has been given many titles, but for the sake of historical continuity, plus the fact that I personally think of God as my Father, I will refer to God as He, Him, in this book, as opposed to it or something else. What we choose to address God as, or think of God as, can be personal, but who, what, when, where, why, and how God is universal, timeless, changeless, and absolute. But as vague and unclear as my concepts of God were at that time, the funny thing is, I never doubted his existence. But I would on occasion test that existence, or try to find out what it meant. When I was young, I would roll a coin down the middle of the floor, expecting a certain result. If the coin veered right, God was there in the room with me. Or I would ask him to fill my empty coin collecting book with rare coins. Even though I would give him a few minutes, the case would always be empty. But these were just the explorations of a child, and the results never dampened my belief that God was real and essentially good. I found it comforting to know that there was someone who was truly watching over me. Home life around this time was, from my vantage point, a cocoon of safety, consistency, and love. My mother was the consummate caretaker who was always there for us, whether it was the middle of the day or the middle of the night. My father was my absolute hero. He was a real, living, breathing fighter pilot, and I would listen to him for hours talk about his exploits in the Navy during the Second World War. It didn't take long for me to develop a real passion for all things relating to war and the military, especially modeling. Almost all of my playtime revolved around me being an Army soldier or fighter pilot. I would spend hours creating battle scenes with my model airplanes and toy soldiers. My love of all things military prompted me to join a youth organization called the Cub Scouts. The things that appealed most to me about the organization were the uniform and patches. After the thrill of the image wore off and it was time to get down to actual scout business, I quickly became disinterested and quit. This would become a trend with me when it came to organized activities and formal instruction. Upon entering the 3rd grade during the fall of 1973, my world, as well as my understanding of the world, began to expand. I recall being shocked to hear from kids at school that families moved around and that parents sometimes split and separated. I couldn't fathom either of those things happening to my family, but it wouldn't be long before one of them, divorce, would become a very real and distinct possibility. It was around this time in my life when I noticed that there was something seriously wrong at home that I was totally unaware of when I was younger. My father had a serious drinking problem. And by now, it was beginning to rear its ugly head. My sister and I would be playing outside only to see Dad's 1972 Pinto swerving all over the road as he was coming home from work. Other times he would pull into the driveway and miss it altogether, running into rocks and over shrubs. It's a small wonder he never hit anyone or got into a serious car accident. Then there were the times inside our house and the vicious arguments between he and my mother. These incidents were the most painful for me because I feared he would become violent and actually hit her. My dad was my hero, but I remember clearly thinking to myself, "Don't you dare lay a finger on my mother." To my knowledge, he never did. My father never believed that physical violence was an effective way to solve problems. These hard times didn't last very long because my mother soon issued him an ultimatum: stop drinking or lose your family. It was right then and there that my father quit drinking, stone cold turkey. I never saw him drunk or take another drink of alcohol again. Looking back on his history and all that he had been through in life, this must have been a monumental struggle, as it is for many of those who endure the hardships of war or have lost a loved one, as well as an epic triumph for him. I am extremely proud of my father for what he accomplished in turning his own life, and with that the life of our family, completely around. Chapter 3. Life is Good Again. With my father back on the right track, life at home felt good and safe again. A typical Saturday would start with me going out to breakfast with my dad, and then to a nearby hobby shop to purchase mostly 1/72nd scale World War I model fighter planes. Later in the day we would assemble them to the music of Charlie Parker and the smell of black coffee and Camel cigarettes. When the weather was good, my mom would take me fishing to one of the many area lakes and ponds. Time after school was spent playing with the neighborhood kids. The woods behind our houses were like shopping malls of nature, with all kinds of treasures, and the little ponds and streams were our arcades. We'd catch frogs and tadpoles and fish for kibbeys and perch. We'd scour the ground for insects, worms, snakes, and salamanders, then place them all in a small container to see what would happen. Another activity of ours would be to dig a small hole in the ground, gather up some small branches, and start little campfires. There was something very soothing about sitting in front of and tending to a fire. We could get lost for hours just feeling the warmth of the fire and staring into the flames. Fortunately, we were cautious enough not to burn the woods down. Most days during the summer months were spent at the ocean. Mom would pack the car in the morning with food, towels, chairs, and maybe an umbrella, and my sister and I would each get to take a friend to go spend a long, sun-drenched, fun-filled day at the beach. We would spend hours riding waves, building sandcastles, and collecting seashells. And on our way home, we'd stop for a lobster roll and ice cream. It was a great way to spend a summer's day. At elementary school, I was making new friends, getting good grades, and discovering a natural ability I possessed: painting and drawing. I was the man when it came to art, and I enjoyed my lofty status. It was also at elementary school where I got into my first and only fight. I had always shied away from the slightest hint of violence, and my combatant could probably sense this. It is this fear of confrontation that would lead to my being bullied just a few years later. But this fight happened all so quickly, and what this fight was over, I still have no clue. I remember being shocked and stunned when she, I'm not kidding, suddenly lunged at me. The next thing I knew, we were both rolling around on the ground, and then a minute later we were both in tears in the principal's office. To me it was a senseless affair, and one I hoped I would never have to experience again. It was also during this period in my life that I began a lifelong love affair with music. I had always enjoyed listening to the AM radio hits of the day, but it was a new TV sitcom that would open my ears to a whole new and different world of music. During the mid-1970s, The hit TV series Happy Days, based on the life of a middle-class American family during the 1950s, had a huge influence on me in two ways. One, it gave me a glimpse into adolescent life, and second, it introduced me to the rock and roll music of the 1950s. I remember being immediately drawn to the basic chord structures, as well as the raw, primal energy of its rhythm and blues influences. Many punk bands during the 70s and beyond were moved by these same musical attributes. Suddenly, I found myself buying and collecting 45 RPM records by the likes of Chuck Berry, Bobby Darin, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, and of course the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Aaron Presley. What fun I had using a tennis racket for a guitar and a floor lamp as a microphone to pretend I was the king performing in front of the entire school. It would be a couple more years before a TV show would change my taste in music, as well as my life. The years rolled slowly along, with third grade becoming fourth grade becoming fifth grade, and in June of 1976, I graduated elementary school. Little did I know of the monumental changes and challenges that were in store for me.